Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you all for joining from wherever you happen to be right now. It is a pleasure to have you with us for this webinar that's in observance of UN Day 2021. FOGS gives a great value to the United Nations and what it represents, despite our occasional criticism, and you'll hear some of it today. We are very supportive of this idea, and we know that you feel the same. We'll have an opportunity to discuss all this with the president and the vice president of FOGS, Richard Kinley and Yuriko Yasukov, respectively, as well as the board member, Harris Gleckman, who will make the main presentation. Before we start with the messages from our president and vice president, I would like to tell you a few things about the organization of the webinar. We have the panelists that you now see. After the main presentation, we can elevate to panelists other participants too. So those of you who would like to be elevated to participate in the discussion afterwards, please raise your hand during the main presentation so that we can bring you in and we can see your windows when we start the discussion. But before that, let me welcome Richard Kinley, the president of FOGS, with a message on UN Day and what we're trying to do here. Thank you.
Thank you, Yorgos. It's really a pleasure for me to be here and to welcome all of you to this webinar. We're very excited at the actually very distinguished list of people who've signed up to be with us today, which I hope bodes well for a really vigorous and good discussion. UN Day for me is one where I tend to look back on successes and achievements of the UN, things like the smallpox elimination or ozone layer protection, nuclear non-proliferation, children's health. So it's a day to feel good about what has been achieved. I think it's also a day when we can celebrate milestones. Last year, of course, was the big 75th anniversary of the United Nations. But for example, we had here in Bonn, where I live, a small event on the weekend marking the 25th anniversary of the UN in Bonn. And I was really struck by the community of people of goodwill who come together around the United Nations because they believe in its mission and its mandate and that it will and must make the world a better place, and people who value the work of the organization. But now here we are after 1 or 2 days after UN Day, and I think it's now time to set the celebration aside and get down to some serious work. The global problems that the international community is confronting really do require significantly ramped up global action, global solutions. And the global institutional system really, I think, was a creature of the 1940s world, and some very serious work is needed to come with solutions how that system could be elevated to the demands of the 21st century. So that's why FOGS today convened this discussion and has been working over the past months and years on some of its own ideas about how the system could be upgraded. I must say, I find it really encouraging in the last year or so to have seen this groundswell of interest in governments, in academia, think tanks, even in popular culture about what institutional changes would be necessary in the wake of the UN's 75th anniversary. And finally, I'm hoping, it does seem that there is a chance that we will at long last see some progress be made, although I would not want to underestimate the strength of the force of inertia, as always. I know that the discussion which is about to begin will be a very rich one. I hope our background paper has helped provoke thinking and gets everyone's intellectual juices flowing. And it's only one of quite a number of pieces that are now on the table for governments, but also those of us in academia and think tanks to think about. I wanted to give you a couple of pieces of food for thought for what is coming. As someone who worked in the UN in climate change negotiations for almost 25 years, I must say I have come out of that experience deeply skeptical of governments and of business and how they live up to or don't the promises that they have made. So I'd like to offer two provocative points for you to address in the discussion which comes up. The first is, as the institutions of the UN system are reformed and strengthened, how can we maximize mechanisms for accountability? This is either formal and legal mechanisms or reporting and review systems, or even engagement of civil society as the police person or the watcher of what happens and a force for pressure. And this accountability would need, in my view, to be applied to governments, to international organizations themselves, as well as to private sector undertakings. And the second point I would ask you to think about is, I'm convinced of the importance of networking and the engagement of civil society, but I think we all need to be honest and not caught up in naive enthusiasm about what this might entail. Private sector entities are not benevolent actors, and they're also not equal to states. I think that there needs to be quite a bit more discussion about how these actors can be engaged, recognizing that they are acting in their economic interests. And this, to me, was amply demonstrated through 25 years of climate policy and climate negotiations and a good solid decade of greenwashing, which has overwhelmed in many ways those who have genuinely been trying to promote change. So with those 2 points, I hope that I've stirred people up just a little bit and contributed to what will be, I'm convinced, an absolutely fascinating discussion, and hand the floor back to Yorgos.
Thank you, Richard. And your history and experience with the UN and UNFCCC are very well known, and we take the points very seriously for the discussion afterwards. And now we go to Yuriko Yasukov, our Vice President, who has a different experience in the UN system, in country teams, with UNICEF and others. Please, Yuriko. You are muted, please.
Thank you, sorry. So thanks to Georgios and Richard, and welcome everyone. I guess from my part, given that we are undertaking this commemoration of UN Day in the midst of a global calamity, a crisis, I think one would want to ask if we take seriously this idea of taking crises as opportunities, and this really is a huge, big crisis, how are we going to do that? How is the UN going to work differently? I mean, really differently, so that countries, and most of my experience in the UN is at the country level. How is the UN going to really do things differently so that countries, governments, societies, private sector included, do what needs to be done? And particularly, how is it going to address situations where they aren't, as so many times happens? Not only not doing what they're meant to do, but many times the exact opposite of what this very document is exhorting all of us to do.
Oops. The connection from Costa Rica doesn't seem to be too good. We'll wait for a moment. These things happen in live shows. So if Yuriko does not return, I can just repeat a bit the rules for the next phase. We will hear the main presentation. reviewing our common agenda for a resilient world. There is Yuriko. We lost you, Yuriko. Please unmute and continue.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The internet connection is. I'm actually in New York, but the internet connection we have is it's not working very well. So in order not to go on, it's really, I guess the question is, how can we all this exhortation that's in this document for things to be done differently are actually
I'm afraid the New York infrastructure needs improvement, and we knew it. Those of us who used to live there some years ago, but seems to have gotten worse. Yuriko, please, you keep your comments for the next phase. The main part of our discussion, the beginning of our discussion, is a paper that Haris Gleckman and myself wrote, authored, and you may have seen it already on the Fox website. And Haris will present now the main points, reviewing our common agenda, the Secretary General's our common agenda report for a resilient world. That is our goal and what we have in mind. So Haris, with all your experience from UNCTAD, economics, international civil society, please go ahead. Just to tell you again that afterwards we'll have 3 rounds of discussions about 3 areas that Haris will touch upon. And you can either participate by putting your comments and questions in the chat, or you can ask to be elevated to participate with your own window inside the webinar. And for that, please raise your hand, right? Electronically, you can find the button at the bottom of your screen normally. Thank you, and the floor goes to Haris.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to take part in this. Let me do the screen sharing bit. I've lost that. Sorry for the need to reshare the screen here. Hold on. There we are. I'd like to start the conversation by saying that we are part of an ongoing discussion. Yesterday was the 3rd informal discussion on this paper, that is the Secretary General's paper, in the General Assembly. So there's a lot of dialogue going on. And I think that one of the things which we are looking at is how should global governance, ideas raised in the paper, and evaluate them, come to our own assessment of them, and think of what role FOGS could play going forward in the next couple of years. Part of the premise that's in back of our assessment, and I think probably shared by many here, is that today's multiple crises cross different organizations, have different multidimensional aspects, and frankly, the current system we have in the UN system is not designed to meet these challenges. And a part of our collective thinking is how should that happen? So the issue is, let's look at what the Secretary General suggested, as well as his informal first introduction. And I want to be candid with you. The paper suggests that the proposals are in general not bold in the area of global governance. And I also want to say that looking at across them, there seems to be a strong weakening of the intergovernmental part of the United Nations system because of increased engagement that's being advocated for multi-stakeholder governance and leadership and decision-making through a multi-stakeholder governance system rather than an intergovernmental one, and is the definition of which topics should be handled by multi-stakeholderism, which contemporary issues, the participants, etc., are being done by the Office of the Secretary General. This represents a significant increase in strength for the Secretary General's office vis-a-vis the intergovernmental system. Let me, in this presentation, explain why these observations have evolved from looking at the text. But front and center for us at FOGS is to figure out what kind of contribution we and those around us can make in this process, which is now opening a door for the next 2 years of public debate on global governance. The first part of this public debate, as suggested by the Secretary General, will be a high-level advisory board proposed now of elders, former government heads of state or government, who will take on a range of topics, and then a proposed multi-stakeholder summit of the future. And this creates another opportunity for us to figure out how we can contribute in the context of the suggestions the Secretary General is making. Secretary General has some ideas about what the UN 2.0, as he calls it, should look like. First is that the UN should become networked, inclusive, and effective. The combination of those three words appears at least a half a dozen times in this one paper. He also calls for part of the UN to offer more relevant, system-wide, multilateral, multi-stakeholder solutions to the challenges of the 21st century. What do these new phraseologies mean in terms of defining a UN going forward, or UN 2.0? Network multilateralism is the newer phrase, and it comes from a combination of directions. One is a scholarly one, which looked around in the 1990s and 2000s by social scientists, international relations scholars, to say some things are happening in the world that don't seem to be led by any particular country or any particular UN body, but they are happening, and we ought to call that a form of governance. One of those criteria of that process is that each part makes its own network connections with others. At some point in the 2000s and 2010s, this moved from a scholarly descriptive phrase to a political phrase in the public arena, which was presented in part to say, look at all these things which are being governed without state leadership, without United Nations leadership, and so we don't need to be engaged as leaders in this area. In fact, there is nothing that says any guidance in this network multi-stakeholder group how to move a topic to encourage directions, to move from point A to point B in this manner. This makes the conjuncture of talking about network multilateralism and effectiveness very complicated. There are no descriptions in the paper of how do you judge effectiveness and hold any individual node of the system that is occurring to be effective or not effective. And so the conjuncture of these two terms becomes, in my mind, seriously problematic. The second element of the Secretary General's description of the UN 2.2 is centered on expanding the role of UN-led multi-stakeholder responses. There are 8 of them in this one paper. The contrast is that there are not 8. In fact, there are 0, no new calls for multilateral negotiations on any topics. So the direction of growth of challenging topics from the perspective of this paper is in the multi-stakeholder direction. That even includes the 8th item on this list, the high-level multi-stakeholder summit for the future. I think it's very important to note that when a group of senior former diplomats, former foreign ministers issued a statement in support of this paper, what they said is that they support the call for the summit for the future. They did not say that they're sharing in the view that it should be a multi-stakeholder summit of the future. And I will return to that in a moment. Secretary General does say that he wants to take 2 new institutions, an emergency platform for crises and a repurposed trusteeship council. Let me say something about the repurposed trusteeship council. This will be very difficult procedurally. There are the terms of reference of the trusteeship council are embedded in the charter. The composition of membership is in the charter. It is not a body based on universal membership. So even trying to change it by, as has common across the history of the UN, charter reform by practice, will require a good number of parts of the developing world who have multiple ties to the trusteeship council because it's through that process they became independent. There are still geographic places in the world who are waiting to become independent. So that's going to be a difficult one to move forward on. The emergency platform for global crises is another suggestion from the Secretary General. And I think most of the people on this webinar know that FOGS is recommending a Security Council type body for non-military crises called the Global Resilience Council, and its interim form, the Intergovernmental Leadership Council. Let me just share with you a quick comparison of some of the ways in which the proposal for an emergency platform for crises differs with FOG's proposal. I want to only pick 2 of this list in this introduction. One is that for each crisis, the emergency panel would have to be created afresh, and each time a different set of actors will need to figure out how they want to work together in order to address an emergency. The lag time introduced into this can be 1 to 2 years to start to address an emergency. So we are arguing it needs to be a permanent council. And FOGS is also arguing that one of the elements, which is why we are not able at the global level to address issue, is an over-reliance on voluntarism. The emergency platform is also based on voluntarism. Some companies, some governments, some other parts of the international arena will joyfully want to, and with wholeheartedness, want to commit to address the particular issue. But there will be always some governments, some private actors, some other institutions who are benefiting from the crisis or are not interested in doing it. And as with the Security Council, there's a need to have obligatory powers. Most of these that are available in our suggestion are economic powers, constrictions on travel, constrictions on movement of funds, obligatory practices which the Security Council has already put in place, could be used by the Global Resilience Council. The paper is wonderful in the breadth of its coverage of different topics, and each of them could have different impacts on global governance, although presented in the paper in different structural forms. But what I want to raise is that we should think about over the next 2 years is perhaps what items of global governance are not currently being put on the agenda. And as a starter for that conversation during our webinar and ongoing, is to note we're not grappling with the financing of the UN system. We're not saying how to strengthen international court structures. We are not evolving into ways to address the rights of nature. And so I think it's important in our thinking about what role FOGS could play is to consider how we might encourage some of these missing issues to be put on the very wide range of other topics before the discussions over the next 2 years. The calendar as laid out and we can figure is something of this nature. This year, there will be considerations in the General Assembly in different forms. In 2022, the high-level advisory board of elders, as it's currently described, and you can see in our paper, we're querying that limitation. The paper advocates a very, very strong and constructive role for youth in global governance. And we're saying that that advisory board should be a mixture of sort of equal numbers of those under 30 and those over 60. Pardon those who are in the middle of that age range. The advisory board will presumably have some version of public consultation. And then some of those elements in 2022, the Secretary General can do on his own authority. After the board meets and prepares its recommendations, presumably a year later, there'll be a PrepCom and a consultation process preceding the high-level multi-stakeholder summit of the future, which would probably take place in early 2003. And that's the PrepCom and the consultation process. Somehow later in 2003 will be the high-level multi-stakeholder summit for the future. It is a little unclear what is then envisioned is whether the Secretary General will consider the outcome of that multi-stakeholder body as the last consultation on his proposals, or the outcome of that will go back to the intergovernmental process. That is not clear in the draft as at least I've looked at. So our real theme today is what's our opportunity for contributing to this process as to how we might come up with ideas and work with the high-level advisory body and how we might contribute to the multi-stakeholder summit for the future. So that's a overview of where at least Giorgio and I feel we are, and we're welcoming everyone's comments so that we can revise this paper and share it more widely. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present this summary.
Thank you very much, Haris. And now we invite questions in 3 rounds and comments. we saw that Harris talked about the network multilateralism, multi-stakeholderism, this new framework for global governance that seems to be introduced and now really becoming legitimized through also the Secretary General's report. The role of the state, the role of the private sector, stakeholders versus official governments. That's one round. I think we can have 20 minutes for each round. The second round, I would say, would be about the emergency platform, the Trusteeship Council, the Global Resilience Council that Fox proposes. So structural institutional arrangements that could help revive the UN and make it more efficient and effective, most of all. And the third round could be how to intervene in the process that has started and will lead to the summit of the future, if everything goes well and member states also agree to this process. What concrete things we can do in this process to move things in the direction that we think is positive for the organization and for the world, for resilience of the whole world. As I said before, please, if you would like to put your questions in the chat, you can do that. I would invite also some people to join us as panelists. We can do that. If you raise your hand, my colleagues who are taking care of the technical aspects will elevate you so we can see you and be part of this discussion more directly. And in the meantime, while waiting for that, people will be added. I see some questions here from Richard Jordan. Would you like to read them yourself, Richard? Oh, there he is. Okay.
Kalimera, Georgios. I love Greek. I used to be able to speak it. Thanks very much. And Harris, always great to see you and hear your fresh ideas. I have just a few comments. I won't read my points in the chat because that's like reading a PowerPoint. So the ideas are not bold because our language is tepid. The idea of multi-stakeholder dialogues is really could be elevated to multi-strategic dialogues. I can get 10 stakeholders around a table with no idea of what they're going to do. You got to have a strategy. Number two, let's adopt, and people will be horrified at what I'm going to say, let's adopt the idea of the Walt Disney Imagineers who create the new theme parks and attractions at Disney. They literally make physical mock-ups of what they want to do. Third and last that I will mention, the idea of the Future Lab. The Future Lab could be room 8 at UN headquarters. It lends itself to member states, civil society. I prefer NGOs because Article 71 of the Charter uses that, but we include everyone, of course, communities of practice. Let's think what a physical setup for a future lab would look like so that everyone works around a common table with the best digital technology, and let's start to solve problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. I don't know if Harris wants to give a first response.
No, I think we're better to have a wider dialogue. Richard, good seeing you again. And I think that this is the kind of discussion we really should be hosting. Thank you.
Nudara has requested to join us. I really encourage more people to join, and the Nudara representing the young generation, very active with the C4UN. And yeah, if you could please bring her over to our panel. Welcome, Nudara. Please, you have the floor.
Hi, Georgios. Hello, Harris and Richard. So lovely to see you all again. I just wanted to come in with a quick perspective on this, specifically the networked kind of interdependent aspect of things. And I think one thing that I really appreciated from your paper, Harris and Georgios, was the critique of the idea of a networked multilateralism. And I think what the OCA report does is not quite consider enough how this network would work. I think there's so a really interesting paper by Abraham Newman talks about weaponized interdependence. And I think this is something that we really need to consider at the forefront of this idea of a networked multilateralism. You have in a network always are going to have people who are more networked than other nodes, so more interconnected nodes within a network. And this has the added advantage of both information asymmetry, so those within the center of a network will always have access to more information that those maybe are less interconnected within a network. And this also provides a kind of gatekeeping mechanism, right? So you'll always have within a network the ability to gatekeep within other kind of connections and other members of a network. And so I think whilst we should always encourage inclusion and whilst we should encourage having as many people be a part of the system as possible, I think we need to critically think about and engage with the discussion, and thank you for starting that, about what this means for the role of actors and the role of different nodes within this network. How can we potentially, or do we need to potentially govern, have best practices in place for a more networked multilateralism that, despite maybe kind of moving away from a tendency of hierarchy or power asymmetries, may build right into this, right? If we have those that are more interconnected within a network than others. And sort of, as you mentioned, Georgios, I'm very keen on bringing in the youth perspective into conversations. And I think this is something that is of concern for me and many other young people that are thinking about what this is going to mean for our futures, is that whilst you've got the high level advisory board and you've got the UN Youth Office, there's no clear indication of what role young people as a node in this network are going to play going forward. There's whether we're going to be a part, I mean, the language of the high level advisory board is very much about bringing in experience and knowledge from experience and the global elders. But really, we do need to have young people being a part of this conversation if we're going to take seriously the role of the UN Youth Office or the future envoy. And there's also a tendency in the report to homogenize the envoy of the future with the role of the UN Youth Office, but those who are young at the moment and those who are not yet born are very different people, right? So I think that we do need to critically think about what these nodes are looking like, whether these nodes are just member states, whether it's people, whether it's perspectives, regions, civil society. And I think we also need to critically think about how we're going to manage these nodes and the advantages that come from more interconnected perspectives within it all. But I think I've taken up a lot of time now, so thank you so much for the opportunity and also for the very interesting paper.
Thank you, Nadara, really. And please stay with us. I wanted to ask a question, if I may, Harris, to Nadara also. I don't know if there is a difference in the way we think, the younger people who have grown up with the IT equipment, working all the time on Facebook and social media, and they feel very comfortable with that networked world that we do live in now more and more. And us more traditional people, where when I grew up, I wanted some kind of an authority eventually to make the final decision, although I would like to plead, to push, to do all that, and to have a decision taken that is monitored by, again, some kind of an authority. It could be the state at the national level, which should be with good governance and democratic state and all that, or the UN at the global level. So for me, this node management is something that is left vague. And then whoever has the means in terms of money or people to grab almost the management or to control more of its operations, that person or organization is the emperor of the moment. But for me, I want to know in advance what is the governance structure and processes a bit more. Thanks.
I think the last, the comments are really important. If we're going to try and change the way in which we structure international organizations, we have to give some real good arguments for that particular change. And networked multilateralism, the arguments are not yet in the papers, and I think that's very central. What role does the General Assembly play, or any of the other intergovernmental bodies is now quite unclear. As Giorgio was saying, it's really crucial to have a broad range of constituencies make their knowledge, their energy, and their perspective clear to public decision makers. It's also clear, as Nidara was saying, we're trying to make a shift to the role of youth in the world. Those views have to be conveyed to some decision-making body, which we know what it is. One of the disabling, politically unusual features of multi-stakeholder groupings in a networked world is that one of the secretary, in this case, the Secretary General's office, picks who that office thinks ought to be on that body, their scope, their terms of reference. And that takes away and leaves ambiguously who actually makes the decision in that area. What do they do with that news that comes back from that process? When it's appropriate, Giorgio, I can also respond to a couple of questions in the chat, but I do welcome more conversation first.
I don't know if Nidara wants to respond, and we also have Dan Perel who wants to join the conversation here.
Thank you, Georges. I'll keep it really quick because I also love to hear what Dan has to say. But I think, so this is always the dilemma when it comes to a network, right? Is how much governance needs to occur within the network. And I think there's two things that I'll say to what you brought up. The first is, I think this is something that needs to be seriously thought about from the perspective of both the advisory board, but also the SecGen, because I think the decision needs to be as inclusive as possible. The entire argument here is that when you've only got a few focal points in the network, that is the problem, right? So I think you do want to have as many people a part of this conversation as possible. But second, to kind of pick up on your more the digitized aspect of it all and the way that the digital system works, I think even within the UN, there is a lack of understanding of how we use digital spaces. I mean, UNDP, for example, engages in communities of practice. You've got UNICEF engaging in things from a very different perspective. The Office of the Secretary General uses the internet and digital communications from a very different way. And you often find duplication of mechanisms, duplication of efforts as well. So I think even internally, there needs to be an element of coordination of digital networks and what is being understood as the way that we use digital networks to engage with communities. But I think crucially just increasing access to these networks, making sure that it's not just a few people trying to reduce the number of gatekeepers by just increasing the number of people engaged in these networks, I think is, and using communication channels that already exist, I think would kind of be the key way forward.
Thank you, Nidara. Dan, and then perhaps Harris can also respond more comprehensively to what we heard in this part.
Yeah, thank you much. Thank you very much, Georgios. And it's nice to be with a number of good friends in this space. And I'm going to take advantage of your generosity and perhaps offer some ideas that may not be super popular, but I'm curious the response that you would get to them. So as I read this report and the critiques thereof, I really think a lot about the deeper challenges that face the system as it stands. It seems to me that the elephant in the room is state sovereignty. And how much can we genuinely expect an arrangement that gives unchecked authority to the member state unit? So for example, we're always upset about the P5. You know, they always retain their power, but which of the other 186 countries or 88 countries wouldn't do the same? I think in the current arrangement, it gears us towards that retention of power and fear of change. And I wonder how many times we try to rearrange the deck chairs when the ship is sinking. And some of these arrangements, you know, well, many of them are you know, if they were widely agreed to, would be great, perhaps. It's worth a shot. But I'm worried that we haven't even given the current system enough of our effort. So what I mean by that is, why do we not just encourage the system as it stands to actually do what it commits to? Actually fulfill the agreements made, you know, implement the promises that are made. And then once it's not working, we are in a better position to assess it. As we keep rearranging these deck chairs, I fear we are being distracted by idea after idea for how to do it better, when in fact that we've never given one idea a good college try. Now, a few things, of course, we have. You know, the Security Council, we know it's broken, but we also know that with the state-centric policies and approach, it's going to be hard to fix it. So I'm just curious, and I wonder, you know, how others would respond to this talk, I would say, up here, when maybe the real issue is a bit deeper. Are we not being distracted by you know, having the conversation at this level?
Thank you very much, Dan. I don't know if Arthur also wants to add to this, and then Haris, and then we'll close this round, perhaps. Yeah.
Thank you. In looking at your listing of the issues the Secretary General has avoided, he seems to have avoided those things he felt were impossible. I think he's trying to focus on things where he thought there was some practical possibility of making progress, rather than the more fundamental flaws in the whole system that he probably just doesn't see as being within reach at this point. But it seems to be looking at multilateral networking. But there already was some good experiments on that in and around the Rio +20 conference. You know, there was the documents are open for widespread comments. You know, there was a whole series of compilations by UNDP and others. So there's been some experience, and it might be good to say what worked well in those earlier efforts by the UN itself, leading up to the same development goals and so on. There've been a lot of such processes, and I think we should be emphasizing what's worked already and say building on that and can build forward on that as we go forward. One other challenge you already pointed out several times is that networking usually allows the people with the most power to keep grabbing more. And therefore you have to design mechanisms that intentionally look beyond, look at balancing, look at the voices that are left behind, looking at the marginalized groups, giving youth responsibility, not just a voice, but asking them, design some new projects, some new mechanism in the system, and start, pilot projects, getting them to work and so on. So it's actually giving them some direct influence on the ways in which the institutions evolve in the years ahead. The accountability, of course, everybody says that's the biggest problem. And of course, part of it is that the least trustworthy mechanisms that we have in our society today are governments and the private sector, for whom truth doesn't matter. Anything can be changed. National sovereignty is the screen from which you can hide all of your misdeeds and all of your corruption and so on and so forth. And obviously, they're not going to let go of that because it's in their advantage, to maintain that. So I think we need to be imagining the new mechanisms for accountability. What are the things beyond just naming and shaming? Can we imagine some new mechanisms that could take the accountability challenges forward and try to be creatively thinking about how, if once you can change the structure of the system, how would you make this work better? And once we have some positive ways forward on the table, then it'll be easier to say, let's go and try some of them. And I think this, particularly with up to national sovereignty, which of course already doesn't exist because it's been grabbed by multinational corporations and the global economy, and there's less and less control. We need to be looking positively. How do we design new mechanisms and principles and text for national autonomy? What do we need to protect, at the national level? Where do we need to encouraging diversity? And how can we define, the text for some new, revisions to the charter, perhaps eventually, saying this would be the Bill of Rights and Responsibilities for the nations of the world that would, one, give to the global level what has to be done globally, but ensure that you protect as much as possible of the rich diversity of different national approaches adapted to their particular situations. So I think that, helping to design those safeguards, promoting better alternatives will open some doors to, getting through some of the more difficult challenges that go ahead, because they have something positive, saying these are things that may work to address the legitimate concerns of those that are resisting change. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur. And we keep, of course, new mechanisms of accountability, and what Dan said before, the role of sovereignty also, and how we define sovereignty today, things like that. Jeff, thanks for joining our group. You want to say something in this round, or we go to Haris?
Just a quick word on, bringing this conversation into the immediate moment, which is to say that yesterday, the General Assembly had an informal plenary session on the OCA report that included the participation of the Secretary General and, of course, the President of the General Assembly. And, from what I could see, and we're still kind of analyzing all of the contributions of member states and whatnot, but is that there were two different types of proposals put on the table going forward. One of them was a call for a short procedural resolution that would basically mandate the PGA and the Secretary General to move forward in continuing the conversation, essentially, and giving the Secretary General the mandate to pursue those recommendations and proposals under his authority, and then, of course, encouraging member states to do the same under the authority of the General Assembly. There was another proposal put on the table by Pakistan, among others, that really said, well, wait a minute, we really need to take more time to more thoroughly discuss all the different recommendations so that a consensus can be developed. And what Pakistan had called for, whether to be cynical or not about it, but it was kind of interesting that Pakistan had called for what he called an open-ended working group, which kind of brought to mind the mandate of the Rio +20 outcome document that mandated an open working group that ultimately led to, of course, the SDGs, which was a member state driven process in contrast to the MDGs, which was largely cooked up in the basement of the UN. So I'm just taking note of where we're at in the immediate moment and how this conversation, how can we utilize the arguments made in this conversation as we lobby and advocate the member states, the missions themselves, who are ultimately responsible for deciding how the OCA report will be processed going forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much for this update. Of course, you are in the thick of things, and with the C4UN also, and the Civicus, and your knowledge of the system. It would be interesting to see if the high-level advisory board also comes into the picture at what level in all this, the proposals. But I think I'll give the floor now to Haris to conclude this first round of discussions and questions, and then we'll go to the next one. Haris.
I think this is a wonderful discussion, and I think that to bring this first part to a close, I think we have to recognize that there are many forms and ways we've been experimenting for 30 years now to engage multiple constituencies in global governance. I think that that's one of the departures in this paper is that we don't have the concept of constituencies. There are concepts of stakeholders. And in bigger questions, it's not clear who isn't a stakeholder, but constituencies are important pieces and part of our important vocabularies. In the proposal that Fox has developed about a need for Security Council for non-military global crises, which we are facing, there are two pieces which address this set of concerns. Each of the separate constituencies would be invited to create an assembly of their colleagues in that constituency to work out their views to the governments who would be part of the Global Resilience Council. So now we are building on the experience of Rio, but we're not saying what Rio +20 did is to say type 2 outcomes are now a part of the official process. And I think we're building on that because very few people, and I think Richard and Jeffrey worked on, type 2 essentially disappeared after many of the announcements. And I don't think very many people in the room know what a type 1 outcome from Rio Plus 20 is. So I think that what we're trying to suggest is let's move to another experiment where we create assemblies of the different constituencies to provide their views of how to deal with multi-dimensional crises before the Global Resilience Council. Yes, we recognize that some of the key elements of the Global Resilience Council would run against current geopolitical realities. And so we propose an interim first step to gain experience breaking down the silos from the separate specialized agencies to convene on those issues which a particular organization says it's beyond our capacity, it's beyond our terms of reference. Climate, biodiversity has passed the ability of those siloed organizations because they need to work on the health, the agricultural, the economic, the financing in a broader space. So our effort to say is the Intergovernmental Resilience Council could come into being when a certain number of intergovernmental bodies say, we are willing to create a subcommittee of the whole, a subcommittee to deal with these issues, which will work with other subcommittees from intergovernmental bodies, or could be brought together at the convening power of the President of the General Assembly to bring together the presidents and chairs of the existing intergovernmental system to start working on these issues in a less siloed approach. So those are some initial reactions to that, and thank you, George.
Great. Thanks a lot. Let's then turn more to these institutional structural aspects. I forgot to, of course, mention earlier and to congratulate Dan Perel for being the co-chair now of C4UN, right, of the steering committee, if I'm using the right term. So if Dan wants to say something also, how this major alliance of civil society organizations intends to pursue this, its input and also its position vis-a-vis the structural proposals of the Secretary General, like the emergency platform, right, or the Trusteeship Council repurposing.
Yeah, I can do my best to offer a few thoughts on this. And I will say that being a co-chair of a steering committee, it's really a service role, and it's not necessarily for me to say what the position or anything is of the coalition at this time. I think the first thing we want to do is engage in global and regional consultations so that we can understand better what it is that the constituent elements of our coalition really like about the report or are questioning about the report. I mean, I sit in New York. Jeff, who helps support me, is also in New York, and support the steering committee, that is, and we often have this tendency of saying, oh, because we're on the inside, we have the prescriptions and we can solve it all. But in fact, the vast majority of the steering committee is based in the Global South. And I think it will be much better to hear from them and then, of course, the partners and members of the coalition before determining exactly the approach. But that said, with regional consultations starting, we have a couple of really nice goalposts to work towards. And we do have to thank the Secretary General for putting these conferences in place, the 2023 and 2025, so that we have sort of an event around which to organize our contributions and prepare our perspectives and ensure that we are included in all of these processes. And I think at this time, when they're working on the modalities resolution, our real concern is that the Secretary General's call is for an inclusive process. Well, let's see it. And so we want to encourage the member states to encourage that sort of approach by welcoming us. As Jeff was talking about, the Open Working Group for the SDGs initially may have seemed to be a way to close off civil society, but ultimately that became one of the most inclusive processes the UN has seen. So if it's a repeat of that, then I'm okay with it. Put on all the titles of exclusivity you want. If we're actually included, that's what really matters. So I think inclusion at this moment is most important, and then a nice survey of the perspectives of the membership. will allow us to understand the better directions that we can take so that it is truly for the citizens of the world to the best of our capacity.
Thank you very much. Sounds really promising. And of course, it will be exhausting, but the inclusiveness has a cost and an effort. But I wanted to say something about what Richard put on the chat, that the President of the General Assembly's term of office should last for 2 years, perhaps, if we would like to see through proposals like this happening as we had for the 2005 World Summit. There was only 1 year, but if we have this Intergovernmental Leadership Council and other things, like Harris mentioned earlier, there is the suggestion that perhaps the intergovernmental part of the UN also should last longer, but I think that would change the balance between the Secretary General as representing the organization and the General Assembly President. There is always some tension there, and that would perhaps make it worse or make it work differently. I don't know. Please keep that in mind. Who would like to speak from those who are here and those who may want also to raise their hand? Harris, is that?
Let me just try to rekindle a bit of this conversation around institutions. All of us inherently grew up with the current arrangement of the UN specialized bodies, relatively autonomous Bretton Woods institutions, a new collection based in Basel that are dealing with macro finance and stability issues and banking questions. And somehow in our heads, and all those who went through international relations courses in one way or another, this was the firmament of the heavens of how global governance should take place. And I think one of the things which is important is to open the door for ourselves and pretend conceptually a thought experiment that we were in fact involved in the 1930, the equivalent, we should be involved in the equivalent of the 1943 and 45 process, and to figure out, given today's crises of their magnitude and their impact, which are clearly beyond our institutional arrangements to manage, what would we want to see on the table? And I think that that's a challenge that we now have, and we now have, thanks to this process, no matter which route the General Assembly selects, a bigger platform for saying putting these ideas into the public debate. And that's a potential role for FOGS, but I think that everyone should have in their thinking at this point the breadth of new institutional arrangements. Don't hold sacred that the BWIs have to be separate, for example. And let's see what role people think should happen and what role FOGS could try to play as a think tank in this process.
Thank you, Harrison. When we say FOGS, we mean our team, but also all of you and all other friends who can join forces in one form and coalition or another. There is a question earlier posted by Yvonne Rademacher on the Secretary General's emergency platform and the Repurposed Trusteeship Council. And she says, okay, she can see our criticism of them, but if there is no possibility to have any new permanent body, if there is no appetite for such a thing, can you see any value in any of the bodies suggested by the Secretary General for upgrading or creation?
The Trusteeship Council, by its name, sounds like the right place to take on some more work. And the institutional entanglements in the history of why the Trusteeship Council was put as a permanent part of a council within the UN is so tied with decolonization that it's switched to take on, and I think that Nudara was mentioning, the assignment is to engage better with youth and to engage better with the global commons obligations for the future. The scope is enormous. And the challenge would be to figure out how to address those issues, which are crucial, with a new institutional arrangement that may not require opening up the charter, which central to which for many countries will be addressing the veto issue in the Security Council, which would drag that process out. So I think what we need to do is we need to think more broadly. And I'd like to say that what we were trying to do in part with the way in which we came up with the structure of the Leadership Council and the Global Resistance Council, that there's ways of establishing them that do not require a charter revision. It's a series of separate decisions by intergovernmental bodies throughout the system that they want to work in a common subcommittee of all of them, or a large section of them, or that the President of the General Assembly says, we have a global extinction biological diversity crisis going on. I invite you as the president of your intergovernmental body, be it UNESCO or the regional bodies, to join with me to figure out a way in which we can, across all of our organizations, address this question. Does not require, and it can be moved rather quickly. The difficulty then, and the opportunity then, is to build out from the Secretary General's offers and suggestions in other ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Harris. I think, Arthur, who was there when the Trusteeship Council was again discussed as a solution to problems, let's say at the Earth Summit, or right during that period? I think the Trusteeship Council keeps coming back as a potential body for transformation, but it has quite a few problems.
I've not followed this in detail. It's come up, of course, the Security Council was by design allowed to lift the 5 permanent members above any accountability. That was built into the charter at the very beginning. And therefore, it always has the fatal flaw that nobody's been able to overcome, because it was, wasn't designed to really be a body that would solve all the world's problems, only the problems of the countries that could be under the thumb of the most powerful countries. And so it's, and because there's never been unanimity among the 5 permanent members at anything, that basically has paralyzed it from the beginning. So I don't think there's been any chance for the proposals to expand its responsibilities, able to go anywhere, because it's always been against the interests of one or more of the permanent members. So it's often been suggested and never had any success, because that is the heart of the fundamental flaws in the UN system as it's been designed.
Right, and we know that the charter amendment would be impossible, I mean, practically impossible, because it requires a 2/3 ratification, plus including the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. So to have such a major change under the current geopolitical circumstances is very difficult to impossible. Any other comment on the structural aspects? There were proposals before. I see here in the comments in the chat for an Environmental Security Council. There have been in the past such proposals, an Economic Security Council, but they have not borne fruit as of now. We hope that by making it practical, like Harris explained, like not requiring a charter amendment, etc., this a Global Resilience Council can be created from within and be like a pinnacle of consideration of resilience decisions, and with some kind of teeth. But you will tell us more. We are starting the process of making it more known and lobbying a bit for it in the process of the 2 years leading to the summit. But we welcome all suggestions to improve the proposal and make it realistic and doable. Yes, Arthur.
This, in our consideration, in our book on global governance, we thought, well, if we can never overcome the paralysis in the present UN Charter because of the 5 permanent members, maybe the alternative would be for a great majority of governments, apart from some of the permanent members, decide, let's have a charter replacement conference to design a new charter without the fundamental flaws. And if the great majority of countries join in and come on board, and it may leave behind a few permanent members in the short term, but if it works better and it's better funded, then it can propose a merger or a buyout of the old United Nations into a new and better organization. So that might be the creative way of trying to address that fundamental challenge that we've always faced with respect to reforming the UN Charter.
That's a drastic idea. Who wants to respond to that? There have been proposals for communities of democracy, other things on the side of the UN, is something like that, or a global, again, side thing with a different charter? Yeah, Article 109, we hear says that, yeah, there is, of course, a process of every 10 years to reform the charter, right? That was foreseen, but has never been used by member states. And there are some colleagues, even in the World Federalist Movement and elsewhere, that have been asking for a charter review conference, which is long overdue. But again, would that lead to results? Because the amendment decisions have to be made in the same way with the veto, basically, of the P5. If we now go to the final stage, because we have about 15 minutes left, to see concrete proposals, how would you like us as folks to proceed from here? How are you committed to proceeding in the 2 years leading to this summit of the future to get the best possible results? Thanks.
Giorgio Meyer has indicated she wants to speak. You may not see her.
First Nudara, and then we have also Maya with, Nudara is not raising her head anymore. Maya, welcome to our discussion group.
Yeah, thank you everybody for this wonderful discussion. And my apologies for not turning my camera on. I'm out in the forest trying to multitask and benefit from nature while we still have it. So just an offer really, and a suggestion, Giorgio's kind of following up from your question just now. I would propose and I would offer to help to put together kind of like a high level strategy meeting and discussion about how, as Harris mentioned, how do we build out from this OCA report? We know that the Secretary General is constrained in many ways, but I think there's much we can do with a focused campaign, as was suggested, near-term solutions with a very focused international civil society campaign to set up a global resilience council or something similar. So just an offer, and I would also, as well as involving youth in these discussions and the senior wonderful members who have extraordinary international experience and wisdom, also mid-career professionals, for example, those practicing international law in The Hague, who have benefited from this innovation and explosion in international criminal tribunals and who are really in touch with, the progressive development of international law. So just an offer. I think there's much we can do, but we have to put our heads together and we have to be very strategic, also keeping in mind some of the longer term goals that have been, and perspectives that have been raised in this meeting. And even as to charter amendment, there have been charter amendments since 1945, and they succeeded, tiny ones, but still they succeeded despite expectations that they would fail. So I think there are many sort of strategic and overall considerations to think about and put our heads together. So just really an offer. I think this discussion has been excellent, and I think we should take steps forward to strategize more.
Thank you, Maya. That's a great offer to convene a high-level strategy meeting. I think, yeah, we have to think through the modalities, but yeah, I hope the others also agree. As for the charter amendments, just like an encyclopedic note, as far as I remember, it was only the increase of the Security Council membership from 11 to 15 and twice the increase of the ECOSOC membership, eventually to the current 54.
Yeah, but even that was controversial. I'm just saying, anyways, let's discuss it at the strategy meeting.
Thank you. Dan wants to take the floor now from his
I think Nudara actually did have her hand up. She put it. Nudara, if you want to go first, go ahead.
No, it's completely fine, Dan. I'll
Let
go.
you have the last word, or we have heard this also.
Yeah, so thank you so much. I think that this is a great question for how to chart the path forward. And I have two thoughts. One is just to reiterate something that Jeff said, so maybe that's not my thought, but I think the more we can organize a survey of sort of what's out there, and the more we can use, the good resources of colleagues to figure out, again, we can just sit in our chairs and decide what we think is best, but to figure out really what is needed from the grassroots would be really nice. And surveys are easier and easier and more expected. I think that's a good idea. The other one is, it strikes me that the UN works through these groups of friends. They have a bunch of ambassadors who get together, 12 to 20 or whatever, who work on various issues. And I wonder if we want to try to create a civil society group of friends. So get, 10 to 20 really engaged organizations, networks together, to have monthly meetings to draft things on behalf of the group, and then it's a larger coalition. It's like what's it called? A coalition of coalitions, in a sense. Campaign of campaigns is being run by Emilia Reyes, and I'm thinking about that as well. But so that we're not duplicating, and that our voice is amplified with each other. And there are a lot of great organizations that are already doing this work. And maybe if we get together, it may be a little bit of the least common denominator that we get, which is not always the most progressive, but it does give greater voice to those things around which there's a lot of consensus. And then the other issues around which we're still exploring, organizations are welcome to take that independent path. But maybe a group of friends model might be interesting to explore among civil society. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Group of friends, high-level strategy group. Yeah, we'll put them together somehow, and yeah, do it. Now it's Nudara, I think, and Fergus, in whatever order you. Nudara, yeah.
Thanks, Georgios, and Fergus for giving me the floor as well. So just kind of very quickly, and Dan, Jeff, and Maya have already touched on kind of working together. I think CPUN is also working on multilateral innovation hubs, which could potentially play into this as well, of trying to create this group of groups. But I think one thing that significantly as civil society we could contribute towards is whether it be our common agenda or other institutions, and Harris mentioned furthering the Secretary General's agenda, there's often a lack of filtration into other UN agencies and filtering into kind of your practitioners, right, who are working on the ground, doing the work at the grassroots level. And there's just this general lack of coordination is probably not the best word, but there is this lack of filtration of kind of the big picture into the output orientation of a practitioner at the UN. And so I think as civil society, trying to potentially map something like our common agenda onto SDGs or signature solutions or communities of practice that practitioners do use as a metric of success would be a significant contribution from our end. So just looking at what our common agenda says, mapping it onto the SDGs, mapping it onto the 6 signature solutions that are used across so many UN organizations, and just trying to create that, look, this matters for everyone, even if the language seems like it's kind of more at the SecGen level. And so just creating that translation into the work of practitioners is potentially a role civil society can play, with quite significant impacts. So that's just an idea going forward.
Thank you, Nudara. Fergus?
Yeah, thanks, Georgios, and thanks to FOG's team for this excellent discussion of our Common Agenda report. And while we're thinking critically and looking at ways forward, as you've invited us to do in this last segment, I just wanted to recall a little bit more about some of the kind of current state of play that Jeff Hines was alluding to earlier in terms of how these discussions are going forward in the General Assembly. And Jeff mentioned that there is a first procedural resolution welcoming the OCA report under consideration. for the Coalition for the UN We Need, we have been advocating an open and inclusive process for the consideration of the OCA report, particularly with respect to the PrepComs and other participation leading up to the Summit of the Future in 2023, but also the Social Summit in 2025. So it's a little concerning for us that the draft resolution that was put forward at yesterday's meeting has removed a paragraph from an earlier draft that makes reference to the very broad consultations that the Secretary General's office undertook. And those, as we know, followed the whole UN 75 global dialogues process. And what this reflects is that there is a move by certain states to limit civic space at the UN, and of course the pandemic and the limited access to the UN's physical premises also makes this possible. But when we think about successful summitry at the UN and how summits have succeeded in the past, there was reference to the open working group process that led to the SDGs and the many successful conferences of the 90s. Broad participation, inclusive, with adequate time and resources for PrepComs are generally integral and important to successful General Assembly processes. So we have to, in the immediate term, we know that process determines outcomes, and we really need to be just defending our own rights to be participants in this what we hope will still be a multi-stakeholder process.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, I also wrote a comment on the side which one thing is the process that we organize, and that also explained, but how can we really involve the public? When I was growing up and I started to know about the UN, I was very excited about it. But then I tried to find some people who knew more and could organize things together. And I went to the UN Association of Greece. And the people there were older than the League of Nations, I don't know, or whatever. They were before the UN even, and they didn't have time, energy, or interest anymore to do much. And now I don't know if there is grassroots support for the UN, or we have surveys that some people do respond to, but a few million even in a global community of billions is not perhaps showing that the UN has real excited interest and legitimacy in the real sense. Who else? Yuriko also wanted to say something. Yuriko, you wrote a comment.
Yes, hi. Yeah, sorry about my opening remarks that weren't. No, my concern is just, how can we do a reality check on all of these proposals, whether they're about, new bodies or structures, against the needs and the demands of those people who always get excluded from these lofty discussions. Somebody had mentioned doing a survey, but even a survey is not guaranteed to reach those people who are, I'm getting so tired of this phrase, I'll leave no one behind, because it's just, become a cover for not really achieving that. And what happens when those people are not only marginalized but actively harmed by those actors who do represent member states at these bodies? What should the UN do? And against, this is the issue of sovereignty again, but I guess, this insistence in the paper of multi-stakeholder engagement is a way of indirectly saying, well, this is how we're gonna look for a counterweight to the power of the member state governments. But how to do that in a way that's truly representative, where the voices of the people who do get left behind are reflected. I mean, can you even have some sort of election process at the country level? I don't know, but I think there should be a really formal and transparent process that is agreed on by the member states to ensure that those voices are heard.
Thank you. We have like 4 minutes left now, and perhaps if there is no other urgent intervention, I would give the floor to Haris, and perhaps afterwards to Richard and Yuriko if they want to say a few final words. Haris.
Thank you for taking part. I think that some of the ideas are really wonderful and that we ought to address them in our effort to broaden that conversation with a revised background paper for that purpose. I think there's some ways in which we can reach well beyond the boundaries. I think that we ought to figure out what's the institutional way of doing that. If we have national consultations on papers and growth, they produce more wonderful ideas. But of course, they're going to be unique and different, and we're going to have a second round where we show those ideas. I think that one of the things we can do is to figure out institutionally, how do we bring in different communities of people and constituencies into the global governance process, which is based on their constituency, legitimacy, and presence in that group, and not one which asks usually a staff member of the UN system body to go find a few civil society people, go find a few friendly businesses. We need to build this assembly type approach to broadening the way in which each of the constituency groups can get to know each other and to formulate different sets of views. But I think that in our opportunity from the paper is to actually say we should be able to help the international community at multiple levels to describe how they think the new institutions ought to go. And I think that one of the tensions in the paper that maybe didn't receive as much in our conversation or in our background paper is the aspirations to deal with a new social contract, a new definition of global commons, a new role for youth, but none of these are presented with the institutional structure that can really move that conversation along. And I think that the engagement of the youth is an important piece. It's not just a person in an office to reflect those billions. And I welcome the observation that as Fogg's suggestions, should be equally addressed at different parts of the UN system to break through many of the silo existing arrangements and to share this discussion in those places as well. Thank you, and I've enjoyed looking forward to the continuation of this conversation.
Thank you, Haris. Richard?
Well, I don't really think, Yorgos, that there's much to add. I found the discussion really interesting. I was very happy to hear differing views presented, which I think reflects the complexity of the issues that we're speaking about. And I would really encourage all of the participants to stay involved and to work with Fogg's and the team to take forward these ideas and see if we can really, as part of the great civil society, have an impact on the work that is happening in New York and in the General Assembly. So just a quick thank you to everyone, and I appreciate very much your very substantive contributions today.